Good morning, Prof.
Morning, Reverend. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you, sir. And good morning to all of our listeners and our viewers from all around the world. Thank you for joining our live stream today. And thank you for always joining our live stream, especially those who have made this like a part of their routine. We appreciate the opportunities to get to share these things with you. This time we get to talk with Prof about issues of nation building and honoring God with our lives here on earth is a very big honor and privilege to us, to me in person. And today, with Prof, we want to look at the subject of, you know, global relations and nation building. They say we live in a world today that is more of like a global village. The world is very, very interconnected today, you know. And so when nations interact, when we interact with other nations and even interactions within nations tends to generate some level of conflict and tension. Within every social context, we have the tendency for conflicts and tensions to arise. And so we want to consider today, especially taking a parable from the Bible, the parable of the Good Samaritan. We want to see lessons contained therein that can help us, foster peace and encourage nation building, especially when it pertains to global relations in the community of nations. I do hope that these interactions with Prof today would bless you and that you would be able to find lessons that you can apply to your life because we're all called to help build this nation and be witness to God's goodness in the world. And so I'm going to start with just reading the passage of scripture for the reason of context and so that those who are not very well acquainted with this parable can get to understand what it's saying. Luke chapter 10, I read from verse 25. You say, and behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, that's Jesus now, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, saying, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. Do this, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, Who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, and was stripped of his raiment, and they wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him, and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him into an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay. Which of these three thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell amongst the thieves? And he said, He that showed mercy on him. And Jesus said unto him, Go and do likewise. All right, Prof. So there we have it, the parable of the Good Samaritan. To get us started, like I always do, I want you to just run us through maybe like a commentary on that parable before I now begin to take you on specifics from the parable.
Jesus is telling us to treat each other as neighbors. One thing we promised to our neighbors many years ago is that we would not treat them according to the geo-political messages that you get on the media. Where people are required to hate this group or hate that group.
Yeah.
That's what the media sort of displays all around the world. And especially when we're talking about our Muslim neighbors. And so the media is always displaying hatred between Jews and Palestinians and Hamas and the Israeli army in the Middle East there. And people are always provoked to take sides.
Mm.
You know, today you have big demonstrations on the Palestinian side, and those demonstrations are not really for Palestinian people. There are some people that do have a sincere empathy for Palestinian people, but there are a lot of the times these demonstrations are driven by political agendas, and they're financed by dark money just to engineer strife within our countries, hatred and division. The more division we have in our countries, the more political control goes to the leaders. Because, like for example, in many nations, like just take America for example, there's been um, violent demonstrations, antagonistic demonstrations on both sides, whether Palestinian or Jews, and driving a wedge of division within the population over their hatred. And so there's, you know, the civil disunity in America is extreme. And part of it is Palestinian and the Jew division. Part of it is over woke um, uh, um, divisions between white and black people. Part of it is over woke issues about sexuality or transgender. And so every one of these situations has large scale protest movements attached to it, and that are financed by billionaires around the world. And one of the main financiers of these things is George Soros and his Open Society organization. And many of these have been financed through USAID, that so-called NGO that has been exposed recently for corruption and money laundering, and they're not really geared toward aid projects, but political projects. And so these movements are to engender hatred. And when you've got hatred, then the government can say, well, we need to curtail hatred, and so we're going to censor the internet. And even in Australia, UK now, Europe, there are big censorship movements saying, well, we need to curtail hatred and violent demonstrations and outbreaks of civil unrest, so we're going to censor the internet. So this is deliberate. The more division we have in society, the more government can bring in restrictions. It's like any crisis you get. When we had the 9/11 attack against the World Trade Centers in New York in 2001, 9/11, 9 September, when those planes flew into the World Trade Center, that gave excuse to the American government to enact the Patriot Act, which the Patriot Act went through Congress in America then and severely curtailed freedoms of the American people, saying, look, we've got terrorists in our country, and they called it in those days Muslim terrorists. And so now it's Christian terrorists, according to the Biden government. And that means anyone who doesn't like their child to have their penis cut off at school and being called a female. If you're against that, you're a right-wing terrorist, according to them. Or one lady who was praying outside an abortion clinic, praying quietly in her heart, not even opening her mouth, was said to be a terrorist. And so a terrorist is anyone that's against the policies of the government, which is really fascism. And that's what we had in the Biden government. And so back in 9/11, 2001, the attack on the World Trade Centers in New York, all sorts of restrictions were passed upon American people. Freedoms were curtailed because they said, well, they have to stop terrorism. And now people are starting to discuss the whether or not there was complicity of the CIA in that 9/11 attack.
Mm.
These crises, rise of terrorism groups around the world always suit government objectives. It's like a coincidence. Um, and the governments always use these crises, whether it's COVID or financial crisis at the banks or terrorism. They always use these crises to further their restrictions upon society,
Mm.
and all sorts of movement restrictions, censorship restrictions. And when, like, for example, in the COVID outbreak in 2020, they really upscaled censorship on the internet hugely. Um, and these things are not coincidence. Even before COVID was released in 2020 from most likely from the Wuhan lab, possibly from laboratories in Ukraine as well. There are many CIA laboratories, biological laboratories in Ukraine, which Russia took exception to because some of these biological laboratories in Ukraine were engineering particular kinds of viruses geared or targeted towards Slavic people, the DNA of Slavic people, which are Russian people. And so the Russians took this as a direct threat against their people.
Mm.
And um, COVID showed the weaponization of viruses, being not a natural virus, but something that was engineered and released from Wuhan lab. Of course, you weren't allowed to talk about these things on the internet because you were censored. So, as I was saying, before COVID virus was released, before 2020, these operations were rehearsed. So you had major groups coming together like Rockefeller and Rothschilds and Gates, Bill Gates, and all these many others coming together and rehearsing how they would censor information in a COVID outbreak. This is before COVID even outbroke. They called it COVID. And they said, well, if we have a COVID outbreak, a pandemic, this is what we will do.
Mm.
Stop demonstrations, to censor speech on the internet, to enforce vaccines, all these sorts of things. So these things were planned to the minute detail before the outbreak of COVID. And so people began to see this. The COVID outbreak was an awakening to many people because they could see how these certain financial interests were taking over
Yeah.
our societies and determining on our behalf what was right and wrong, what was true and what wasn't true. Like the then Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda, I can't pronounce her name. I don't remember how it's pronounced. Jacinda or something like that. She was on television saying the New Zealand government is your only source of truth. So,
Wow.
the New Zealand government is entirely truthful, and there's no truth anywhere else except for what the New Zealand government says. Well, that is fascism to the core. It's blasphemy to the core.
Yeah.
That is a complete corruption of Western governments, and that was happening all around the world. And so it was a wake up call to people, and that this is what's happening, and we can't. And so we were divided by our governments. The governments, okay, so we're divided by our governments in terms of wokeism. We have demonstrations about gender. I've already mentioned that, or sexual orientation. We have demonstrations about whether we're on Palestinian side or Israel side, and these divisions were engineered in countries like New Zealand, but all Western countries during the COVID outbreak, so that people who believed in the COVID restrictions were on one side, and people who didn't believe on it, and wanted freedom of speech were on another side. And these two groups were pivoted against each other to further divide society. So society was entirely divided by geopolitical messages that come across the media. And as I said before, the more society is divided, the more um, power the governments take.
Yeah.
They say if you people aren't able to get on, there's potential of strife in the community
Mm,
because of
mm,
religion. So we will have to restrict your freedom of speech and freedom of movement to make sure there's no problem on the streets. That's
wow.
exactly what the governments want. So they and particularly media outlets like in Australia, it's the ABC, which is a government broadcasting commission, um, will engender this division as much as possible. That they will never speak for peace, and also wars like in Ukraine and Russia. They will push these wars, like even today, where Trump is pushing for peace. European interest and British interest and media interest are pushing for war. They don't want the war to stop.
Mm,
By all means, this war must continue. And because this war lends itself to social division, it lends itself to more borrowing, printing of more funding, which is more interest rates for the banks, more possibilities for money laundering, and more division in our societies. So, and more power to governments. So, where there's peace, governments lose power over their populations because we return to the rule of law. And so these things are diabolical. They're wicked. Banks are engineering these things. Global financial interests, as I've already mentioned, some of them, and so people who take sides on Palestinian side or Israel side are
yeah.
playing right into the hands of these world banks and globalists. That's exactly what they want us to do, to hate each other and to that's one of the reasons Israel was set up as a nation 100 years ago was for the Western interests, British interests and Western interests to, and
Yeah.
American interests to engineer division in the Middle East so that we could have military installations there and start and control the resources, control the countries. And we can go to war. Basically, Israel was set up as a nation 100 years ago to give the Western nations an excuse to be involved in that region, to go to war against countries like Iraq and Libya and Syria and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on. So most of these strifes around the world, these geopolitical strifes around the world, we see are engineered by the global banks. They're not genuine, like North Korea and South Korea.
Mm,
That's been on for years now, since the Korean War. Back in when was that? In the 50s, 1950s, and so Korea was divided into two nations, and the CIA occupied probably both of those nations, North Korea and South Korea, and have been guiding both of them towards perpetual division since then. Um, and so, because division in Korea enables America to have military bases in the area. They say,
mm,
well, there's division, there's potential for war. There's real danger in that area because North Korea is building nuclear weapons. So America will have to have military bases in that region. So the real target there is not North Korea, but it's China, to control China. So North Korea is an excuse for America to have military installations right all around China, and they can say, well, it's because of North Korea. So the real issues in geopolitics are not mentioned. The press
mm,
doesn't cover them. The real truth of what's happening. Everything is a show, is an act, whether it's 9/11 or anything else, whether it's COVID or anything else, and the real agenda is covered over. And people are beginning to wake up to this and demand, particularly with the internet. It's a bit like the Reformation. Now we have freedom of information
yeah.
that we didn't have before. And people are beginning to wake up to this and research. We now understand that the experts, in inverted commas, are lying to us and that they have financial interest. They say trust the experts, but unfortunately, the experts have financial interest.
Yeah.
They're all looking for big commercial interest, and they're all paid to come up with answers that these corporations require from them. And so this is just human corruption. It's, you know, it's normal. And so we need to gather together as people and spread information, spread truth, research it. Of course, there's not everything spread is truth, but we've got to take some responsibility for um, uh, proper investigation and so on. Because the journalists are supposed to be independent today and do independent research, but they're not independent anymore. So we have to raise up a new class of independent journalists
Yeah.
that will not have a conflict of interest and that will really work on behalf of people. So one of the reasons we have peace here between Muslims and Christians all around us is because, and we used to have real problems when there was a problem in Palestine. I remember 10, 20 years ago, our place would go on fire where we live. Response. You know, Palestine sneezes and Joss catches cold, as they say, and it was serious. But we outreached to our neighbours and said, look, we're not part of this rubbish.
Mm.
We will not treat you according to the geopolitical narrative,
Yeah.
what's happening in other places and what the media says about it, but we will treat
Yeah.
you as neighbours.
Yeah.
Jesus commanded us to treat you as neighbours,
Mm.
and that's our covenant with you. And that's what the
Amen.
Sermon on the Mount is about. So
Mm.
we have a choice today. We can divide over all these issues, um, you know, about Israel, Palestine, or whatever the issues are, and we can have very good justification for that, and we can get very angry and righteous about it, or we can do what Jesus said and love one another,
Mm.
and refuse to fall to this agenda of the globalists who want us to divide and hate each other so they can control us. Um, they want to introduce fascism. You know, either Palestinian fascism saying that we have to hate the Jews, or Jewish fascism saying we have to hate Palestinians. They're both fascism, and so Jesus has a completely different model for us to live by, and that is neighborism. And yes,
Mm.
we're born into a political world, but we can overcome that political world like the Good Samaritan did, without regard to the geopolitics of his day. He cared for
Yeah.
the man found on the road to Jericho. And basically, building peace just means you care for the people.
Mm.
Peace building doesn't mean you have all of these meetings and talk about peace. It just means that when you find someone on the road to Jericho, you look after them. It's about money.
Amen. Yeah.
It's about using your money to help people. You know, it's about money, our
Mm.
money,
Yeah.
and you know, including other people in financial care like you would your own children.
Mm.
So you don't. It's not a matter of talking about peace. It's a matter of showing love and care to your neighbor. That's all peace is about. And when we do that, we have peace. You don't have to have religious discussions and faith dialogues and all this sort of stuff. You don't need to have seminars and talk about peace. You just have to love someone, help them with their
Mm.
hospital, help them with their
Mm.
school bill,
Yeah.
fee bill. Just just reach out to people and show care. That's all. And then
Amen.
peace is a result of that.
Amen.
That's what Jesus taught.
Amen. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
When we look more closely at that parable, a few things stand out. The Bible said this man went from Jerusalem to Jericho, and then he unfortunately fell into the hands of bandits who beat him up and stole from him and left him for dead. And a priest walks by and sees him lying there in this pool of blood, but does not attend to him. And then after the priest, a Levite also passes by, and they are headed to Jerusalem, passes by. The Levite takes his time to investigate the situation because the Bible said that he looked at him. So the Levite actually goes there sees this man lying down, looks at him, and then still walks away. And I'm thinking, why do you go there, see him in that state, and walk away? Could it be okay? You probably think he's not going to make it, or is it that he was so covered in blood and so bruised and beaten that it was difficult for the Levite to identify him? And which is the next thing I want to take you up on, the issue of identity today, because sometimes we are divided often along lines of identity. Could be racial identity, could be religious identity, could be political identity, could be ethnic identity, where we there are so many reasons why we separate from other people and we divide from other people. And we see this also in terms of political representation, whether at the national stage or at a global stage. When it comes to political representation at the national stage, sometimes people are elected to represent the masses, but when they go there, they begin to represent and to distribute benefits on the basis of identification again. You know, sometimes it's religious identification, ethnic identification, cultural identification. These ones are my own people, so I'm going to represent them, my own people. And we see that the offshoot of this is that it brings a lot of chaos and restlessness. Society begins to fragment. Internationally, when we look at international politics and relations today, there's also this tendency of people, relating along lines of interest. You keep saying it. You talk about globalist agenda, the agenda of the elitists, how you have a particular class of people who, because of self-interest and their own selfish ambitions to just keep amassing wealth for themselves, will represent themselves to the detriment of the masses, the world's population. They don't care if people die. Just like the man on the road to Jericho, even if he's bleeding, he's left for dead. He's not one of my own. I've looked at him. I can't recognize him. I can't identify with him on the basis of my common interest or political affiliation or cultural or ethnic, similarity. So I'm going to leave him there to die. And we see this happen in that story because these were people who, on a normal day, were supposed to have responded to that man's plight. Here's a priest, someone who embodies the value of God, compassion, and all of these things. He walks away. There's a Levite who looks at him, and probably because he doesn't identify him, he leaves him there also until a Samaritan, who is thought to be the stranger, comes in and then does something about it. So this I want to ask you, so this challenge of division, this politics of divide and conquer, fragmenting and causing confusion to bring distraction so people can continue, selfish people can continue to amass things for themselves, that we see both in our local politics and international politics. To what extent is it really damaging, the prospects for global peace and relations today? And within our local communities, how much is it a danger to nation building?
Well, the divide and conquer strategy is deliberate. So as we've been discussing, and those that want to control communities and societies, nations, and the world,
Mm,
divide and conquer is always the basic strategy for doing that. Now, if it takes the Bolshevik Revolution back in Russia, and what was that, 19? I don't know, the year 17 or 18 or something like that. They had the Bolshevik Revolution, and that was academically is spearheaded by people like Karl Marx and so on. So Karl Marx was a Prussian, not Russian, Prussian. That we don't have the nation of Prussia anymore. But in those days, in the 1800s, there was a nation called Prussia. That's Prussia, and that nation was around Germany and Poland area, and they had universities, and Frederick the Great was one of the great Prussian leaders. It was just an absolute man of war,
mm,
and so they developed a lot of immorality, pagan worship, Satanism. They developed Nazism, radical Zionism, Bolshevism, communism. All of these ideologies were developed in Prussia. I mentioned this on another session we had. And the purpose of these was to divide and conquer.
mm,
That's why they developed all these different ideologies. Identity politics is what it was all about. Do you identify as a radical Zionist? Do you identify as a fascist? identify as a Bolshevik, a communist. And so these are supposed to be, and also too, radical Islamism, militant Islamism was something that was built as an ideology in Prussia as well. So all the major ideologies today that are dividing the world were all developed in Prussia as a conquering mechanism. Now, most people don't know this today. The Prussian academia, the Prussian institutes of learning and warfare, were developing strategies for dominating the world.
Wow.
And they moved into the CIA later on, and MI6, the British intelligence, and so
Yeah.
on, and took up space in these intelligence communities, and have been implementing these different ideologies around the world today. Like, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood. Guess who founded the Muslim Brotherhood and sponsored it? CIA,
Mm.
MI6. There's a whole lot of evidence on this. This is not just theories. Same with ISIS, and the terrorist organizations down Libya and Gaddafi were sponsored by Western ideology creators
Mm.
and financiers, and the same with Hamas. Even the leaders appointed by Western intelligence agencies and so on. Even when Hamas was running out of money, guess who sponsored them? Um, I was in Kuwait some years ago at Dhofar Airport, and that's where some of the Hamas leaders live,
Mm.
who are billionaires, and they're
Wow.
spending money freely. And the banks there are Western banks, and the businesses are Western businesses, restaurants, fashion design, clothes shops, banking interest. It's all, Qatar's like a state of US.
Mm.
It's an entirely Western run economy. So how can the Kuwait live there? Sorry, Hamas leaders live there as billionaires and freely spending their money through the
Yeah.
Western banking system without Western banking complicity? It's not possible. I mean, the banks know what I have for breakfast here in Nigeria. They monitor everything I do. Not me. I mean, people in general,
Mm.
and they they have a very tight information system on their banking,
Yeah.
global banking. They know exactly what's going on. That's just my observation. There's heaps of research by, I'm talking about top experts like uh, Seymour Seth, I think it was, that investigated who bombed the Russian pipelines into Germany during the Ukraine war. It was America under the Biden government, and they blamed Russia, and no one believes that. Russia's not going to destroy its own pipelines, and basically destroyed the German economy. What America did, and very very serious things that are going on here. But the real truth of who's behind things and isn't coming out. So um, all these different ideologies, what I'm saying, whether it's Bolshevism or communist revolution in Russia, about over 100 years ago, um, you know, you could say academic or ideologically it came from Karl Marx, who was a Prussian, learned everything he did there, and then passed that communism on to revolutionaries who took it
Mm.
into Russia. And what they did, how they overcame Russia, these communist revolutionaries, was they produced division in the country, divide and conquer, identity politics, and so they create unrest, civil unrest, one group against another group,
Yeah.
and then they say, well, the government of the day is not able to manage the country properly. Look at all this unrest. And so the government's incompetent, and we need new leadership and so on. So unrest is a major strategy in pulling down political systems.
Mm.
Governments themselves can even operate the unrest, not to pull down themselves, but to pull down some of the laws and traditions of democracy and government that people have been used to, and say, well, we need more restrictions,
Mm.
in order to handle these civil unrest and so on. So divide and conquer happens all over the world today. It's everywhere, and it's deliberate. These things are not happenstance. They're engineered. They're organized. Money is put into them. You get all sorts of so-called democratic institutes today. The Institute for the Advancement of Democracy. I can't remember what they're called, but they've made a whole lot of institutions around the world that are false facades, and they pretend to be empathetic and benevolent and about democracy. They're fronts, and they're pumping money into countries for revolutions,
Wow.
money laundering into countries to create unrest. All the unrest around the world is created with dark money, and the more COVID and wars we have, then the more dark money can be laundered.
Mm.
So, we have an emergency in Ukraine. Quickly, let's send them $100 billion. But that money is not accounted for. We need to help Ukraine in the war, send them 100 billion, but that money is not. There's no accountability. No one knows where it went. We need to send all these weapons to Ukraine. Well, no one knows what happened to them.
Mm.
Ukraine's probably the most corrupt country on earth. Nothing gets accounted for. And so they love all of these emergencies so they can print money, which is unaccountable. And then they can create revolutions in countries all over the world,
Mm.
civil unrest and so on. So it's all based on the term identity politics. And identity politics is said to be benevolent. We need to, care for these poor, marginalized people. We need to have compassion on the identity group, this identity group or that identity group. This identity
Yes,
group
sir.
is broken. That identity group is persecuted. And so it's all based on compassion, benevolence, and Christian principles of goodness and kindness to marginalized people. But
Yes,
it's a
sir.
lie. That's all the front. It's actually a revolutionary movement that's happening to use identity politics to divide nations, to bring down democratic traditions, and to bring in dictatorial governments that will censor, that will curtail freedoms, that will take authoritarian positions
Mm.
in society and remove our democracies. It's exactly what happened in Russia 100 years ago. And that's what's happening today in all nations. It's deliberate. It's very strategic. So, and it's all based on this false representation of identity politics, whether it's sexual identity, gender identity, racial identity, um, whatever the identity politics is wrong. And I think that the Good Samaritan, I think maybe you said the Levite went over and had a look and then didn't help him. I guess the Levite was counting the cost. If I
Mm.
help a Palestinian, what will the Jews say?
Mm.
If I help a Jew, what will the Palestinians say?
Wow.
What will the people around me say? So the
Mm.
problem is that anytime you help someone, the people who hate those people
Mm. Mm.
will become your enemy.
Yes, sir.
So it's best just to keep to yourself. Just stay home. Don't get involved. Don't identify with people just as simple human beings.
Mm.
Remember their political group.
Mm.
Remember the division that's
Yeah.
between us. And think about that. Think what will happen to you if someone takes a picture with you with the man who wrote Jericho and puts it on the newspaper. Um, uh, it's the end of your promotion as a priest. You'll be left in the village next year. They won't bring you to Jerusalem, where they divide the money. So it's completely against your interest. And I think that's one of the things, 'cause we see that today. People will not identify with somebody who's cancelled. We have cancel culture,
Yeah.
and over somebody has unauthorized opinion about something, and so they're cancelled. And so people will not identify with someone who's cancelled. They won't be saying anything. It's all quiet. No one will talk about this. No one will say anything. But people will not identify with someone who's been cancelled because that will muddy their own prospects, reputation,
Mm,
and
mm,
prospects. Life. And that's the kind of world we live in today. People don't discuss. I don't know how much it is in Nigeria, but in the West, people don't talk about issues because they don't want to be cancelled.
mm,
We'll talk about the weather. We'll talk about our pets, our pet dog. Um, we'll talk about things, just not everyday things, but we won't talk about any issue that might lead to us being cancelled. Everyone's quiet
mm.
on the politics of the day and the dangers. If there's a man on the road to Jericho, no one will talk about it because they don't want to be identified with him. So that's the kind of world we live in, and we need brave people that are going to say no to that kind of world.
Yeah.
We want freedom. We're going to do what the Good Samaritan did
Yeah.
and hang the consequences. I mean, we die as a free human
Mm,
because to live under these the way that these colonial masters want us to live, that's already death. There's no life in that. We're not humans. So Jesus taught us what a human is. Jesus isn't just teaching us about faith, which he is, because a human is a person of faith.
yeah.
But these globalists want to take away our faith, want to take away our humanity, want to take away our neighborliness towards each other, and put walls between us
Mm,
so that we pass by each other and don't discuss certain things or get involved. That's the kind of world that the globalists are creating. And we can't have any part in that, of this kind of division in our societies.
mm,
We've got to love our neighbor as ourselves. So Jesus is telling us what will protect us from becoming a zombie,
mm.
you know, dead while we yet liveth.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Yeah.
uh, he's teaching us what will protect us from dying on the inside. And that's the most important thing. The globalists, will restrict us, um, but they can't stop us. Dying on the inside is our choice, whether we will allow them to do that to us or not.
Mm. Just to reiterate something you said there, on a more moral side, on a lighter note, you talked about how today people may decline to give very basic assistance or help to people they should help because of the backlash or people turning against them for helping those perceived as outsiders or enemies. A few months ago, I traveled to one of our states in the country, and I was interacting with a cousin of mine there, and he had ties to he's an engineer, a civil engineer, so he's connected to companies that do a lot of projects. And during the last regime in the state, they handled some of the state road construction, the projects in the state. And so when I was asking him how his job was faring, he just kept lamenting about how this new regime came and kind of cut ties with everyone involved with the last regime. So if you were known or anyone could identify you as a friend of the last regime, be sure that you're not you're not invited to the table in this regime at all. So he was saying, you know, jokingly to me that, in fact, it's so bad that, say, maybe people from the last regime are taking a photograph, and you happen to be like 50 feet in the background, maybe just minding your own business or walking past, and the camera picks you up. Someone could just, zoom in and show you and say, see this person, see him in this picture. He must be involved with he must be involved with them. and that could be the end of your whatever
Mm.
good was supposed to come to you from there. So this tendency to, where
So there
especially in
must
our
be a few people from the old regime on the road to Jericho,
yeah, yes,
and no one is stopping for them.
no one is stopping for them at all. So I was saying to him that it meant if you actually even needed something from this regime, you had to cut ties, whether pretentiously from people you knew before who were not in good terms with this regime. And in Nigeria, the common name we have for that is we call it opposition. So in Nigerian politics, you keep hearing of opposition. They'll tell you that this one is people from the opposition, people from the opposition. It could be people from other political parties, people who hold maybe a different political opinion or who are not really up for the policies being put forth by a particular administration, a current administration. They are quickly banded as opposition. And what happens when you are banded as opposition is it becomes you are just a fool. You don't have the capacity to make sense. Nothing you say matters at all. So we have a state of affairs in our country where people, intelligent people whose mind would have been a blessing to this nation going forward, one about nation building or peace building within our society today. Intelligent people will be able to also come up with policies that can drive this nation forward. But because they are being banded as opposition, nobody wants to take what they are saying seriously. So even we can't have objective criticism. Even when criticism is objective, if it's coming from somebody who is banded as opposition, it's as good as nothing. They think, okay, you are speaking out of envy, you are speaking out of hate, you speak because you want to undermine government. And as such, we lose valuable input from intelligent and gifted people that should have made their own very healthy contribution towards driving this nation forward. But because we think in terms of, okay, we and them, we on this side and them on the other side, those who are not with us are the opposition. And if they are the opposition, we can't relate with them. We can't accept whatever they are saying. We can't take anything they are bringing in. We tend to keep shortchanging ourselves as a nation. But that being said, I want to ask you now, you see, I want to ask about the subject of what true worship entails. Our community is quite religious. Nigeria is always said to be a very religious nation, and sometimes people wonder, one of the criticisms against us as a people is as religious as we are still quite backward, when it comes to industrialization, when it comes to care for one another, when it comes to building peace and relationships. We have not made the kind of strides that the people who claim to be God fearing and God honoring ought to have made. And I think that, it brings to mind the question of what should be the token of true worship. What does true worship entail? We see the priest who embodies like an intermediary between God and the people. We see a Levite. All of these were supposed to be like God fearing servants of God, people who were representing God. And on the way to Jericho, probably they were going to Jerusalem to be part of the worship, and if by Jewish custom, if they were going to Jerusalem to fulfill their own obligation of worship in the temple, they carried instruments of worship. And we see that the Samaritan on the road to Jericho sees that man, and the Bible says he pours oil and wine into the wounds of this man. He pours oil and wine into the wounds of this man. In the Old Testament, in the Bible, we see oil and wine as emblems of worship, also instruments of worship. He does his own worship on the road to Jericho. The other ones go to the temple in Jerusalem, neglecting an obvious need on the way to Jericho. So I wanted you to just speak to us quickly on what does true worship entail.
Well, I think there are. I know you believe also there are a lot of Nigerians who whose faith does demonstrate true worship. People focus on the bad testimonies,
Yeah,
the people who claim to have faith and yet don't demonstrate it through neighborly care. But there are a lot of people who do. There's a lot of very good actions and care and love. But most of it's not seen,
I agree.
and it's because it's not done, for applause or
Yeah, yeah, for clout or social media
yeah,
publicity. Yes, sir.
yeah, not done in the open. And but God sees, and there's a lot of that in Nigeria, heaps of it. But no one really writes home about it very much. We write home about the atrocities and everything.
Mm. Mm.
Um, yeah, but true worship is the Good Samaritan was not a person of God. You know, he wasn't a Jew. He was from the wrong. He didn't worship at the temple in Jerusalem. There's a whole lot of things he did wrong.
Mm.
Um, but he demonstrated faith, genuine faith. Whereas the people that were said to be the God-fearers did not demonstrate faith. So that really was an unfortunate story that Jesus told
Mm.
for his own welfare, to be telling the Jews that they did not demonstrate faith while the Good Samaritan did. I think Jesus needed a better public relations officer. I'm sure whoever it was got the sack after that day. Um, so that was a real mistake. And you know, and Jesus was, I'm sure, he'd be called an anti-Semitic in
Mm.
today's world. Anyone that says anything. And he went, if you look through the Gospels, he went to the synagogue at Nazareth and preached to, you know, that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me.
Mm.
And from Isaiah, and said, this day, this scripture is fulfilled in your ears. And they all got angry and were murmuring. I think, was that the place where they called him son of Joseph or something? And anyway, he started to critique them and said, well, in the Old Testament, with Elijah and Elisha, God went to the Gentiles,
Yeah.
not the Jews, because the Jews were unbelieving and superior. You know, the Jews felt they were better than everyone else, so
Mm.
they didn't have an open heart towards God. But the Gentiles did, like the widow and the woman and so on, because they were not classed as the special people.
Yeah.
They had a more open heart towards God. You know, more humility
Mm.
and more childlikeness about them. And so God isn't looking at the race; He's looking at the heart. He doesn't look out on the outward man; he looks on the inner man. And He said that for us to enter the kingdom of God, we must come as a child. That's not favoring Jew or Gentile. That's a heart issue, nothing to do
Mm.
with the flesh.
Mm.
And so there are a lot of these stories. And when Jesus told them that at Nazareth, they got really angry and tried to push him off a cliff because he said it was the Gentile widow that God helped. Well, you can't go around saying things like that. And so there are a lot of statements like in the Gospels, you know, that showed God's favor towards the Gentiles, and it's again nothing to do with them being Gentiles. It's just the heart.
Mm.
So I heard someone yesterday, um, a global official, saying that Christianity is the primary source of anti-Semitism
Wow.
because of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels and Paul as well. That he says, "I go to the Gentiles." He had problems. He was persecuted by the Jews. And you know, and the Bible just tells the truth about these things. It's not the Scripture does not recognize the you know, the man. What do you call it? The fear or favor from man. The Scripture's not interested in pleasing anyone. Or that's one thing I like about the Scripture is that it's not covering over the sins of the people who write it.
Yeah.
You know, like the sins of David are all there in the Scripture. Well,
Yes,
if
sir.
I would have dealt with the man who wrote the Scripture for revealing my sin with Bathsheba and Bathsheba's husband. That would have been the end of their career. Uh, and if he wasn't alive then one of his sons could have dealt with him. Um, But there's none of that. The Bible reveals everyone's sins.
Mm.
It doesn't care about who they are, or their race, or their identity.
Yes,
The
sir.
group they belong to. That's one of the reasons I like the Bible, because it's not interested in using any particular identity or any conflict of interest. It just says it the way it is. And we've got to get back to that way today. We've got to say things the way they are.
Yes,
And
sir.
there's a lot of people lined up to cancel us, especially if you're running for politics. You will be lambasted for identity sins anytime you speak. And the politicians that get called anti-Semitic or homophobic or
Yeah.
what's the other one, against immigrants, immigrant phobic or whatever the term is. Um, the reason they're called that is because their policies, their governmental policies, are counter to the banks. No, it's got nothing to do with the truth. Like there
Yeah.
was one guy, Jeremy Corbyn, who was running for prime minister in in the UK, who was against war, and he was effectively against war, which is one of the major industries of banks.
Mm.
So he was lambasted as an anti-Semitic. It was a smear job on him, and just because he wouldn't go along with the policies of globalism, but he would stand and represent the people of his nation, Britain,
Mm.
and be honest towards the welfare of his own citizens. And so people that are called homophobic or whatever it is, no one can say anything. No one can speak truth today because they will be destroyed in the media.
Mm.
Reputational destruction, reputation assassination. It's very lethal. And so, um, what I like about the Bible, it doesn't indulge in any of that. It's just straightforward. It just tells the truth. It doesn't care whether you like it or not,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it doesn't stand for any group. Um, it teaches the resurrection from the dead because that's a fact.
Mm.
It teaches, family values because they're facts.
Mm.
It teaches morality because they're facts. It teaches truth and honesty because they're
Yeah.
facts. It doesn't care who you are, what group or race or religious affiliation you come from.
Mm.
Facts are facts, and that's the way the Bible is written. And I really like it for that. That's one of the reasons I like.
Mm.
When something is straightforward, you can trust it. It's just like people today. If you're looking for medical advice, if they're selling something, just turn it off. You know, um, if you're doing research, just you got to go to people that aren't sponsored by somebody.
Mm.
Um, and the Bible doesn't accept the sponsorship of man.
Mm.
It's just written the way it is. If you don't like it, then that's your own problem.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, before we round up today, I want to ask you one more question, and I think this particular one has some geopolitical significance. Now, at the close of that parable, when Jesus is done telling the parable, he turns back to the young lawyer who asked him the question in the first place, or who is my neighbor? He says, of these three people, the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan, who was actually the neighbor? And the young lawyer said the one who showed mercy. Now, in the community of nations today, or in the League of Nations, when we look around the world, there are sometimes nations that are classed as superpowers. There are nations that are classed as developed nations. There are nations that are classed as developing nations. Sometimes even called a term, especially people within those continents don't like being called third world countries. But in the community of nations today, if we were to ask this question, when we talk about, global relations, international relations, as company, as nations interact with each other at the global stage, politically, economically, and all this. Let's ask this question of who is the neighbor and how should that neighbor be treated today in the League of Nations, especially in the light of socioeconomic international politics today. There are bigger nations and there are smaller nations. Sometimes there are, like we talked about, nations divided along lines of ethnicity, economic interest, politics, religion. Religion has become a major issue today. Sometimes people are demonized because of their religion, their race, all these things happening. How do you answer that question at a global stage today? Who is my neighbor, and by implication, who is my enemy also?
Well, I think the first thing, the fundamental thing, is to respect the sovereignty of another nation.
I hear you, sir.
Yeah, we don't have any of that today. No nation's sovereignty is respected. The globalists and international law believe that they have right of say over every nation, and really these are the big finance, the big capital owners
Yeah.
who own the global capital and the banking system. They're the ones that apply sanctions to countries if they don't believe in homosexual marriage or transgender. They will implement economic sanctions.
Mm.
So that's colonialism. It's cultural colonialism, and we have in Nigeria, for example, family traditions, family values, and it's no one's business to interfere in our cultural values, our traditions.
Very true.
So these globalists don't have some sort of moral high ground whereby they, claim that something is moral and something's not. You see it on television all the time. The person that identifies with homosexuality is modern, is forward thinking, is inclusive. But what they're doing is disregarding family values that are destroying
Mm.
children's lives.
Mm.
But none of that is mentioned. Um, so it's completely biased and one-sided and sponsored television program. This is just normal entertainment. You get this.
Mm.
The media, Hollywood, all these sorts of industries are completely owned by these global oligarchs, and they implement cultural colonialism through the television set. I like the word television means television.
Yeah.
They
Mm.
are telling the vision,
Very insightful.
and yeah, which we have to accept. And I just turn it off. Um, I haven't listened to mainline news for years. Once
Mm.
I could plainly see that they were lying, deliberately lying. I stopped listening to them. And a lot of people are brainwashed by television. And there's this thing called, where the media and so on will deliberately lie to us and then intimidate us that if we don't believe that lie, that we're fools.
Mm.
Um, I'm just can't remember the actual term for it at the moment, but they they will deny us any private interpretation or any use of our own observational powers or logic or reasoning,
Yeah.
and they tell us what the truth is, and anyone that doesn't agree with it is intimidated and called a fool. Um, so this is cultural colonialism, and it's all over the world today. They tell us what culture we must adopt and accept,
Mm.
and if we don't do that, we're not part of the modern world. We're mean people. We're exclusive people, and so on. But if we're trying to defend family values for the well-being of families, for the well-being of children, for the well-being of our society, that's not exclusive.
Yeah.
That's that's what you introduced before, nation building.
Mm.
And you can't build a nation without families.
Amen.
But the globalists have no interest in nation building. Their only interest is in owning nations, controlling nations, and underdeveloping nations, so these nations can't become strong and a potential competition. So the first thing about nations and interactions and relationships is that we must respect the sovereignty of another nation.
Mm.
And this must become we have all these traditions today about, the United Nations and global relationships and global this and global that. Every time you turn the TV on, you are brainwashed into accepting values. You must do what the globalists tell you.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're not a good global citizen. But that's got to change. This sort of global awareness, if you like, or image or demand has got to change, and we need a new global culture of respect, which means you don't try to impose your cultural values upon another
Mm.
nation,
Yeah.
another people, or your political controls. That the politicians of a nation must be allowed sovereignty and freedom. You can't put sanctions on the country because you don't believe in their policies.
Yeah.
It's none of
Mm.
your business.
I hear you.
Um, to be using economic power like that is evil. Um, or even politicians are assassinated today. Even terrorist groups like in Libya, and this happened in lots of countries. Terrorist groups are sponsored and raised up to unseat presidents that don't toe the line, that don't agree with globalism. It's happened all over the world. And if we had time, we could go into all of these, deliberately sponsored terrorism by Western interests or globalist interests to bring about regime change. Or sometimes the leaders are just assassinated. There's a lot of this, like the man who committed suicide by shooting himself twice in the head. Um,
Interesting.
and that's now we have the term "he was suicided." Um, yeah. um, no matter what happens to the person that was suicided, and that's close of case. That's happening and it has happened for a long, long time in globalists. For at least 200 years or more. This is common, and so we've got to allow for globalism to be unseated,
Mm.
and to give respect for sovereignty, political sovereignty, economic sovereignty. So economic policy in a country is no longer determined by International Monetary Fund or World Bank, but it's determined,
Yeah.
like Nigeria, we have a committee for economic policy, but I'm not sure when the last time they met was. They just call the director of the IMF and ask what they should do today, International Monetary Fund, and so the Nigerian sovereignty on economic policy is completely bypassed.
Mm.
Well, that's Nigeria is not Nigeria in that case. It's not a country. It's just a puppet.
Yeah.
And so, political sovereignty must be respected. Economic sovereignty must be respected, and not just by mouth, but genuinely respected. Cultural sovereignty must be respected. And if we don't like the culture of another country, we can't go to war against it.
Mm.
We can't be involved in regime changes because we don't like something. Or because we're more righteous than they are. There's been so much of that. In the last 70 years, America has been like Superman, flying in with their red cape to implement democracy and implement the common good through warfare.
Mm. Mm.
We're coming to help these people by bombing it to smithereens,
Mm.
and they should be thanking us. And how many civilians have they killed? How many
Wow.
refugees? Millions and millions have they made?
Mm.
The
Mm.
whole thing is totally diabolical,
Mm.
but they claim it's righteous.
Oh.
I mean, all this sort of thing has to be overthrown, and spade has to be called a spade here. This is the delusion and the brainwashing of most people in the world who watch television, and they
Yeah.
are told the next attack on a country is for the good of humanity.
Mm.
You know, how much were we told that about Libya? I remember when Libya was being attacked by NATO, and the
Yes,
television
sir.
was saying, "Oh, no, we've got to save the people of Libya, from Gaddafi." And they loved Gaddafi. It was a lie. Oh, we've got to save people of Libya. Well, you go to Libya today, it's an open market slave market.
Mm. Mm.
That's how much they've saved Libya. They destroyed it. And there's no accountability. NATO should be held to account for that, what they did to that country,
Mm.
because it was all about economics. It had nothing to do with love for the people.
Mm.
So this sort of globalism has to stop. And the first thing we need in relations with other countries, we must respect one another's sovereignty. And then after that, we must work together as individual sovereign nations on our own merits, or on our own conditions, not having the global bodies tell us how to relate to other countries.
Mm.
The World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization, go through intermediaries that will tell
Yeah.
us, how we are to behave together on a global level. We decide. Nigeria decides how it interacts with another country. No one
Yes, sir.
decides for it.
Mm.
We go to that country. We discuss things that are of mutual benefit between us as two countries, and we make our own decisions on trade and currency and finance and resources. So first of all is respect the sovereignty of another country, and secondly, make our own decisions about how we relate to people on around the globe. We should have our own relationships with America, our own relationships with Russia, our own relationships with individual countries of Europe, and build them on the basis of our own diplomacy and our own values and our own economic
Mm.
aspirations, not being told by some committee abroad about how to relate to another country.
Yes, sir.
So I think this sort of humanity has to be restored,
Amen.
um, of respect for each other, and not have globalists sitting in committees telling us what we can and can't.
Mm. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Prof, I know there's a very busy day ahead of you today, but thanks for taking the time to still come talk to us today.
Well, I'm grateful, sir. Thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah. Have yourself a
Yeah.
great day, sir. And for every one of you who joined our live stream today, thank you very much. See you again during our next podcast. Thanks, sir.
All right. Good day, sir.